This is Ed Rep Radio, presented by Eastman Music Company. This is Ed Rep Radio, a podcast to bring you ideas and information from industry experts you can use on the road every day. Presented by Eastman Music Company, and I'm your host, Shane Dool. On this episode, we are digging into the saxophone with Ryan Richman, saxophonist and vice president of Eastman Music Company. Ryan possesses an encyclopedic knowledge on the history of the instrument, as well as its design, manufacturing, care, and maintenance. You will learn a lot of great information from Ryan on all things saxophone. Ryan Richman, welcome back to Ed Rep Radio.
Thank you, Shane. It's so nice to be back on the program.
It was great having you on in season 1 with the Trusted Advisor episode. And, funny enough, I was just listening to that episode on the way to the airport. It's nice to go back and listen to those older episodes once in a while. And I listened to your episode and just was reminded how good that one was. And if somebody's listening right now, I do recommend go back to season 1, listen to Ryan on the Trusted Advisor. And we learned there that you know a lot about a lot, and you've studied a lot of various topics. And is it safe to say that one of your favorite topics is the saxophone?
I think it's very safe to say that. Yeah, I have been a student of the saxophone since my early years. I think I started saxophone at like 11 or 12 years old. And it was the first instrument that I wanted to play. Even though doubling happened in my life where I, took on clarinet, bassoon, flute, and whatnot. But really, saxophone was like what I wanted to be, was a saxophonist.
Yeah. And you've studied a few things on the actual instrument itself and the history and all about different makers and models. Is that right?
Yes. Now, a lot of my library is books on Mr. Sax and his invention and the history of the saxophone. And if there is a book out there about the saxophone, I generally buy it without question. So it's a topic that I really enjoy.
All right. Fantastic. Okay. Well, let's dig into it. So the history of the saxophone, now, I know a bit about it, but I know it's one of the newer instruments in the band. But tell us all about it, Ryan. Where did it come from? Who made it? And why did it even become a thing?
Well, it is very much one of the newest instruments in our ensembles. It didn't exist in the classical era. It didn't exist really before 1846. So Mr. Sax, he was born in, I think, 1814. November 7th, 1814 in Dinant, Belgium. Somebody will correct me on the date if I'm wrong, but he was born in the early part of the 19th century. His father was an instrument maker. He played the serpent, and I think he made cabinetry and things like that. And Adolphe was his nickname. His given name was Antoine Joseph Sax. And his father's name was Charles Joseph Sax. And his grandfather's name was, again, Antoine Joseph Sax. So I think he got a nickname Adolphe, not to be confused with his grandfather.
Okay.
But his father was the royal instrument maker for the King of the Lowlands. And so he was an instrument maker. And his son, young Adolphe, he learned to make flutes and clarinets before he was 10 years old. So he was making instruments at an early age. He started out as a flute player and then later a clarinet player. And he was very virtuosic on his instruments. He could outplay a lot of people throughout his lifetime, which was part of his drama later in life. He used to challenge people to playing duels, because he was convinced that his instruments were better than the competition. And so he started out at a young age, and he had a nickname, the Ghost Child of Dinant. And
what a nickname,
right? He was called that because he nearly died 7 times before reaching adulthood.
Come on.
No, seriously. And the 7 ways. Let's see if I can remember them off the top of my head. I don't have my books open. I'm just sitting at my desk. But let's see. He swallowed a needle.
What?
And he drank muriatic acid,
By accident.
thinking it was milk. He fell down like 3 flights of stairs onto a cobblestone floor and was knocked out for, I think one book I read said a week. A slate from the top of a building fell down and hit him on the head, knocking him out cold. Can you imagine something falling from like a tall building and hitting
No.
like a roof slate?
Yeah. This man is incredibly unlucky.
Right. He was pulled from the river, drowning head, like face down. So like a passerby in the village pulled him from the river. Dinant has this river that runs through it. So somebody pulled him out. So we're up to 5. He was burned on a stove. He fell onto a burning stove and burned his whole side of his body. And the last one, he was blown across his father's instrument workshop from a gunpowder explosion. This was before smokeless powder, like back in the days of black powder, and so it would go boom. It just wouldn't burn like today's powders do. So it just blew him across the room. So
what you're saying is we're lucky to even have the saxophone.
Right?
As a thing,
right?
Because he survived.
He survived
7
all
times.
of those. That he could have been in the movie Final Destination, right? Like,
no kidding.
Yeah, he survived all of those things, and he was winning competitions at a young age, making musical instruments. And in fact, one of the reasons he left Belgium and went to Paris when he went to France was because he got the silver medal at a musical instrument exhibition because he was too young for the gold, according to the judges. And, he's like, well, if I'm too young for the gold, I'm too old for the silver. And he packed his bags and he left Belgium for France and to try his hand at making instruments for the French military. And Paris was just a much bigger place than where he was coming from. So he did that in the early 1840s. And we saw some sightings of the saxophone, which was originally a bass instrument in C. We saw some of those sightings in 1839, 1840, 1841 in some of the books that I read that shows that there was an unusual instrument underneath a cloth or a cloak. And at one of his instrument exhibitions, somebody got mad and kicked it across the room so he couldn't show it in like the early 1840s.
Not very nice.
No. But eventually he applied for a French patent in March of 1846. And it was granted in June of the same year. So there's 2 dates that are often associated with the patent of the saxophone. I think one is March 21st, 1846, and that's when he applied. And the other one is like June 22nd, and that's when it was granted.
I'm just shaking my head over here that you have these dates memorized.
Well, it says I teach a class on this, right? So I've gone to several universities and I teach a history of the saxophone class to the saxophone majors, and so you repeat something enough times and it starts to sink in. But I could be off a little bit, but that's what's in my head.
All right, so 1846 you said was the
1846.
actual invention. Okay.
Yeah, and it was an invention
officially
rather than an evolution. You look at most musical instruments, they evolved from something more primitive. The saxophone isn't exactly that. Some people have compared it to ophicleides or sarrusophones or other things of that era, but the saxophone was quite a unique instrument. And what he was trying to do, what he wrote down that he was trying to do, is give outdoor ensembles the volume and the power that a brass instrument would give you, but also give you the facility of a woodwind instrument. So you could play, faster notes basically and have them be louder. And that's kind of the reasoning behind it. It started out as a bass instrument because if you think about the difficulties with outdoor performing in that era of time, bass instruments don't project very well. I mean, bassoons of that era did not project well at all. String basses do not project well at all to a certain distance. And so when you're talking about, a military band or an ensemble, you wanted to have a lower bottom, bigger sounding bottom end of your ensemble. And so that's originally what the saxophone was supposed to do. Adolf worked a lot on low woodwinds, and he had quite a few inventions to his name, not just the saxophone, but he's pretty much responsible for the modern day bass clarinet as well. And
No kidding.
yeah, I mean, before his adjustments to the bass clarinet, it was kind of a very soft-spoken, narrow bore, not really, projecting type of instrument. And he kind of updated it with a larger bore and an upswept bell, and it
Yeah.
gave it kind of what we know the bass clarinet to be today. He had a great influence on. And the saxophone, in a way, takes his abilities as a flutist and a clarinetist, and puts them into an instrument that simplifies a little bit. A flute overblows an octave, a clarinet overblows a 12th. That is harder. The 12th is harder, right? Because you have different fingerings for upper register notes versus lower register notes. And so to get an instrument to overblow an octave, that helps you with facility in learning the instrument. And then making it out of brass and making it conical, it gives you a lot of volume and rich sound. So that was his reasonings behind the invention. But he was well known for all instruments. He also created things called sax horns, which were essentially, precursors to modern day euphoniums and tubas. He had sax horns in different keys and in different voices. So you had huge, gigantic contrabass sax horns, which would have, taken the place of the modern day tuba. He had a full catalog of instruments, and he had, so it wasn't just saxophone. In fact, saxophone was not his primary purpose in life. It was really just to make band instruments. And he had a full catalog, and he wanted to sell them. But when he got to Paris, the establishment in Paris were quite not kind to him. I mean, they didn't like this Belgian outsider coming into their city and selling instruments, and quite frankly, probably making instruments that were better than theirs. And so they actually formed an alliance to persecute him. They didn't put it that way, but essentially that's what it was. He was sued 30 times in his professional career. He went bankrupt 3 times. There wasn't a period of time where the United Musical Instrument Alliance wasn't litigating against Adolf Sax for something. So he had a lot of hurdles to overcome. And later in his life, he even developed cancer. He had a large growth on his mouth that made it impossible for him to play. And he actually,
again, unlucky,
right? But he didn't use modern medicine. He actually sought out a person from India, and they treated it with spices, herbs. Like they put something on it. It was all holistic medicine. And he was cured. Actually, the growth went down, and he was able to play again. And he retired later in life. He left the business to his son Adolf Edward Sax, and I believe he died in 1894. So really, actually, before the saxophone gained its prominence, the saxophone really didn't gain prominence until the 20th century. And it was mostly there was a saxophone craze in the United States. The 1920s are known as the saxophone craze. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Was it more popular here in the United States before it became popular in Europe?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting.
It was a novelty, really. And actually part of the saxophone craze was the novel nature of the saxophone. It was very popular with vaudeville. And, back in the 20s, we didn't have television, really. There were parlor music. That was the form of entertainment. So, the best-selling saxophone in the 1920s was actually a saxophone in C, so that you could play with piano, and you could play with piano without transposition. There was a huge craze of saxophone, not just in jazz, but in other genres as well. But American manufacturers really put the saxophone on the map early in the 20th century. We made more saxophones in the United States than they did in Europe, for sure.
Huh.
And then the Japanese didn't even get
Okay.
on the action until the 50s. So really, in any real numbers until the mid 1950s, there were a few before, but what we know today, really, you could say 1950 was when the Japanese really started to make an impact on saxophone making. So started out in France, grew into Europe, but then America got a hold of it in the late 1880s. I think the first saxophone that was built in America was built in 1888. And it was built by the C.G. Kahn Company. And Chairman at the time at C.G. Kahn was a guy named Gus Bisher. And he left Kahn in around 93, 92, 93. There's some dispute on what the exact dates were that he left. But there is a letter that he wrote to the Kahn Company where he had already started the Bisher Band Instrument Company of Elkhart, Indiana. So it's around that 1893 timeframe. And he started to make saxophones as well. But Kahn was the first company to make a saxophone in America in 1888. And it was with Gus Bisher as the foreman. But then the saxophone craze, the 1920s, and then the rise of saxophone makers. You had Kahn, you had Bisher in Indiana, you had King in Ohio, you had Martin. Trying to think, those are the four biggest ones. And then there were other things that they made cheaper versions of them too. So like I think that Bisher had the Indiana brand. I think Kahn had the Pan American brand. King had the Cleveland brand. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to even market the saxophone then too. So like they made these other brand names to kind of keep the esteem of the real brand. Like the Kahn brand had an esteem, and so the Pan American was the less expensive version, if you will.
Okay. Started to go into the maybe student versus pro kind
Yes.
of divisions way
Yeah,
back then.
completely. Yep.
So I'm really curious. How did the saxophone go from Europe? Obviously, it sounded like it became popular in the U.S. And then how did it become such a popular thing in school bands? And how did it become popular in jazz bands?
Well, I mean, it became kind of the voice of jazz, really. If you look at where the saxophone grew to prominence, it was in the jazz community.
Through
Well,
vaudeville? Through that kind of the
vaudeville
start?
first, but really the jazz musicians got a hold of it, and they, then there was just a prolific line of jazz musicians that play the saxophone, and spread that all across the world, really, with their travels and
Yeah.
whatnot. How it came to America, I don't know exactly, but so there was a guy named Patrick Gilmore. And
Oh, the Gilmore Band.
Patrick Gilmore, he had an exposition, I think it was in the 1860s, called the World Peace Exposition. It was after the Civil War. So, like, we were celebrating peace, right? So it was late 1960s. And he had this exhibition, the World Peace Exhibition, and they brought over bands and ensembles from Europe. And one of them was the Republican Guard band from France. And it's got a French accent, and I'm saying it wrong, but they had a saxophone section in that band. So we had bands coming from Europe with saxophone sections as early as the 1860s, and that's when Patrick Gilmore first heard that. And then there was an immigrant who came from Europe by way of South Africa named Edward Lefebvre. And Edward was the saxophone king. That was his nickname. He was the saxophone king. You can find ads of the Gilmore Band and their solo saxophone player, Edward Lefebvre. And I'm sure that's a French accent, and I'm sure I'm saying it wrong. But he was a great saxophonist, and he was actually later a consultant with the Kahn Company for manufacturing the saxophones here in the United States. So, you can see an artist relationship with a manufacturing relationship kind of at every stage, right? And in the beginning, the artist was Adolph Sax himself. So I think that, what you're going to see is that the saxophone grew to popularity quickly. It started with this the French Republican Guard band coming from Paris with a saxophone section. Gilmour hearing it, wanting to add saxophones to his band. Later, Sousa had saxophones in his band, and then the jazz musicians got a hold of it. And you had Sidney Bechet first with his soprano saxophone, Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young. Like the list just kind of goes on and gets quite prolific. And that's when it really took a hold, was with that saxophone craze, that vaudeville era for the amateur music and the home music, the parlor music, and then the jazz, the growth of jazz from New Orleans and the musicians that gravitated to the saxophone and made it what it is. So that's kind of how it developed, and then it became popularized in all kinds of ways. I mean, think about music, like even James Taylor has a saxophone solo on one of his albums. And, there's been a saxophone soloist with Billy Joel. And so the saxophone has been used not just in jazz music, but also pop and rock music. Earth, Wind and Fire, Tower of Power. Like there's saxophones in so many places. And I think that drives the popularity. Plus, it looks cool, right? I mean, it just looks cool, and it's loud and it's honky. And I think when we're talking about beginning bands and junior high bands and why the saxophone is so popular, saxophone is a relatively easy instrument to make an initial tone on. Right?
Okay.
It's a little bit easier and more forgiving than flute or clarinet. So if you're looking at wanting to be a woodwind musician, saxophone has some appeal because you can get a sound with relative ease. However, I think in my studies, I feel that it's one of the hardest ones to have a mature sound. And so while it's initially very easy to make an initial sound, I think it does take a lot of refinement to make it a beautiful sound. So when you're doing these instrument petting zoos and stuff like that, man, you can get a kid to sound on a saxophone pretty fast, versus flute takes a lot of effort. And so people get discouraged when they can't make a sound initially, and so they gravitate to saxophone. One thing I think that smart my wife does, actually, she tries to control the population in her junior high band of saxophones. And so she requires you to start on the clarinet. So the pathway to saxophone is the clarinet for her. And you have to get good results on your playing tests. Like you have to get an average, like 9 out of 10 or something on all of your playing tests. And when the time comes, you have to write an essay on why you want to play the saxophone. So she really puts like a lot of emphasis on playing the saxophone to just make sure that she doesn't get a band that's too out of balance, right? That she doesn't have too many saxophones versus clarinets. But
makes sense. You have to really want it.
That's right. Like, and then she also encourages doubling, so I think that's another thing that, as ed reps and people out there in the field, when you're looking at these kids that want to play saxophone, and then you have like a saxophone band with some trumpets, and it's too many saxophones, and you don't have good instrumentation, and you need twice as many clarinets. I think that encouraging them to start on clarinet, telling them and teaching them that they can double, and it actually gives them more opportunities later in life, and it makes them a better saxophone player, and it gives them the knowledge of playing clarinet, and it's a good step to the saxophone, and that they don't put the clarinet away. I think that helps a lot of kids like start on the clarinet, my own daughter included. Right, we have a young one, our second child plays the clarinet, and she just started saxophone like at the beginning of this calendar year, so only a couple months now has she been doing saxophone.
Okay. Very cool. Very cool. So I'd like to get into the different voices of saxophones. It seems like the saxophone is one where you see quite a few voices, more than other types of instruments that have also other voices. And I'm talking about soprano, alto, tenor, bari. It seems like you can see most of these in a high school band.
You can. And
it seems unusual.
Well, it shouldn't be, though. So the clarinet family is actually larger and should be larger. And we can go into philosophical conversation of why a clarinet choir should be more utilized in music education today, and that people are underserving harmony clarinets. because I really think that's true. When some of the best bands I've ever heard have contra clarinets and alto clarinets and a full clarinet choir, bass clarinets. And we don't do that. And I think we don't do that for budget restraints and
Sure.
scared teachers sometimes too. Like that's a lot to teach. That's a lot of different things to keep track of. But I really think that you should see more than just soprano clarinet and bass clarinet in an ensemble. You should see contras as well. Flute has a little bit of a family with piccolo, and of course there is alto flute and bass flute, which you don't see a lot in concert bands. But yeah, no, saxophone, the proper instrumentation for a concert band really should be 4 to 5 saxophones, and that is all. And that can sustain a concert band of 100 players. You should have 2 altos, a tenor, a baritone, and if needed, a bass. And that should be the instrumentation. The first alto would double on soprano. And that would give you the full range of a normal concert band. But like the clarinet, the saxophone was invented as a family of instruments. The patent wasn't just for a single bass saxophone in C. It was for 2 unique families of instruments. One geared towards orchestral playing, pitched in F and in C, and one geared more towards band playing, pitched in B flat and in E flat. And so you have these 2 distinct families. There are saxophones in F and there are saxophones in C. And that was part of the saxophone craze of the 20s, where instrument makers couldn't make enough saxophones. And so you see a lot of C melody, or I call them smelody saxophones, because every one I've ever opened up the case just smells terrible.
Probably because they're really old
and they're not played very often, right? So you have these 2 distinct families. Obviously, the B flat, E flat family won out in the end, and that's what we see in mainstream today. And we see that in our concert bands. So really, that's really the proper instrumentation for a concert band or wind ensemble. And making additions to that, just adding a lot of saxophones, can put the band out of balance a little bit. That's why you'll see a lot of teachers put a lot of emphasis on clarinet, because in that same band of 100 people, in my opinion, where you have 4 to 5 saxophones, you probably should have a total of like 40 clarinets in all voices. In soprano, in alto, in bass clarinet, in contra clarinets. That would be an ideal instrumentation, so to speak.
Okay. So let's dig into some of the mechanics of these instruments, starting with the most popular of all the saxophone family, and that seems to be the alto
Very
sax.
Much. Yep.
Why do we start on altos? Why do beginners start on altos, not sopranos?
I think it's a size thing. I think that soprano is a little bit more difficult to play. Soprano is a little bit more difficult with pitch and intonation and whatnot, and it requires a mature embouchure. Remember how?
Okay, so that comes later.
Remember how I said it's like easier to get an initial sound on the saxophone versus the clarinet? Well, the soprano sax is even smaller than the clarinet, and so there's no room for error, so to speak. So really, alto is a great beginning instrument, and I think, in my own opinion, like any saxophonist should start on alto, not even tenor. When I was teaching lessons, if I had a young student, 10 to 12 years old, we would always start on alto first. And it has to do with size. It has to do with the physical size of the instrument, and just holding it around your neck and having your hands reach everything. And so alto is a great place to start. If you decide that alto is your voice, a lot of times altoists will double on soprano. Rarely is somebody just a soprano saxophonist.
Unless you're Kenny G,
unless you're Kenny G, and then he totally is heard in around the world. In fact, in China, the national song of "Going Home" at the end of the work is a song that Kenny G wrote called "Going Home." I can't tell you how many times I've heard that on the train in China. It's hilarious.
Hilarious.
Every day at 5:00, it's played everywhere in China. But the alto is great, and if that's your voice, then soprano is a good double, and the more advanced you get, the more you'll play that. If tenor is your voice, Again, soprano is kind of that double. You see a lot, like Coltrane played tenor and soprano, so he liked the B flat instruments. And baritone players, again, I think you should start on alto and then add baritone later, and then that is a size thing. Baritone is a large instrument. It takes a person that can hold that up, and put a lot of air through that instrument in order to play. So, alto is just the best place to start your saxophone journey, in my opinion.
Okay. So these are all made of the same material, and let's just get into the really basic information here for a second. What are they made of?
They're made of brass. So they can be made of nickel silver. They can be made of sterling silver. They can, but the saxophone sound that is in our heads listening to saxophone is a brass saxophone for the most part. That is what has been recorded the most. That's what we hear the most. So there are players that play on silver-plated instruments or sterling silver parts, like you can have a sterling silver bell and maybe a sterling silver neck. King did that as early as like the 30s, I think. You had sterling silver parts on King saxophones. And so you can have different materials, but mostly brass.
Okay. And this is 70% copper, 30% zinc, right? For yellow brass?
Yeah,
somewhere in there?
Everyone's different, right? But generally speaking, cartridge brass is what has typically been used on saxophone, or some variant of that. Maybe it's a 68, 72 variant, but that has been traditionally yellow brass instruments. There are some instruments out there that are being made today out of red brass or gold brass. They don't seem to me to be as prevalent as just your good old brass saxophone.
All right. And then if it looks different, then it would be a coating on the brass, right?
Yeah, if it's got a slightly different shade, like there's shaded lacquers, right? And lacquer tends to darken over time too. So you'll have some vintage saxophones that look super, super dark. They weren't that way when they were new. That's done over time. So if it looks different, it could be a plating, or it could be just a tinted lacquer. And in fact, even, I don't know if it's before the 60s, but they had colored lacquer even way back then. Like you can get black lacquered saxophones or white lacquered saxophones, or even a pink lacquered saxophone I've seen from the factory. Like you could get different shades of lacquer, both in Europe and in America. But the catalogs show colored lacquered saxophones even way, way, way back.
So how does the silver plating or the black nickel or the lacquer, how does it affect the actual overall sound of the instrument? Let's say you have the exact same instrument and you put these various different platings or lacquers on them. How does each one tend to change the sound?
So this is a controversial question. Yes, there's going to be so many people that either agree with me or disagree with me, but I will give you my 2 cents. When you plate something, I believe that you add a little bit of surface tension to that instrument. And that makes sense to me logically, because now you've got this metal on top of it clinging to the base material. And so I believe that it adds a little bit of surface tension, which to me, from a player's point of view, tends to add some projection. It will help me sound further away than way up close. I may notice a difference in response because of that surface tension. It may respond a little bit quicker, but that could be placebo too. Like because every horn is slightly different. So is it the plating, or is it just that particular instrument? But to me, it adds that surface tension and gives you a little bit of a boost on your projection. And that's for silver plating, and that's typically the most common plating. Nickel plating to me adds harshness to the sound. It's not as mellow and pleasing a sound to me. It's like smooth jazz players tend to like a black nickel plated horn, or like some of the more alternative styles, but you won't see like a straight ahead jazz guy typically playing a black nickel plated or a nickel plated saxophone. Not usually. That there's exceptions to that rule, but it just adds a bit of a harshness to the sound. Not a bad thing, just more aggressive in its sound. Yeah.
Okay. And then you have lacquer. What's the difference between plating and
Well,
lacquer?
lacquer is a paint, and plating is a metal. So when you plate something, you dip it in a plating tank, and you add metal to that product. Lacquer, you spray it on like paint, um,
Okay.
and and lacquer again. Well, it adds weight. Everything adds weight. So when you're painting a saxophone, you're adding weight to it. And what to me, what it does is it kind of centers the sound a little bit. Plating will do the same thing, gives you some projection, adds a little bit of focus, adds a little bit of center. Um, and lacquer will do the same, not to the same extent in the projection realm in my mind, but it'll add a little bit of focus and a little bit of center to the sound. And an unlacquered saxophone will be a broader sound. It will be wider. It won't quite be as focused. And these are all difficult to describe sound, I guess, when you're talking in this
Yeah.
arena. But to my ear, that's how I would describe it. With a lacquered saxophone, if the sound was a round circle, it'd have a very clean line. And in an unlacquered saxophone, if you had that same round circle, it would be kind of a fuzzy line.
Got it. Okay. So it makes a difference. All these different materials on top
It
of that
does
brass.
make a difference. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So we have the body made of brass. We have a few options to plate or lacquer that
Yep.
brass, and then we get into the key work itself. What do we need to know about differences in saxophone key work?
Well, I mean, so as far as like materials or range or like,
Well, let's start with student level
okay.
saxophones. What do we do as a manufacturer for student level saxophones to make sure that these keys are going to function
Well,
properly?
I think you make them more robust, right? So when you're talking about an entry level instrument where you've got these fragile mechanisms on top, what you would do is you would make them more stout or more robust for a student model instrument. That doesn't necessarily translate to better quality sound or better quality in the facility of the instrument, how fast you can play it or how comfortable it is, but it translates into more durability. Um, so for our student models, like and a lot of student models in the United States, you'll find that the keys are nickel plated because it will add a level of strength and finish and
Hmm.
wear that will be better than lacquer. Lacquer tends to be not a permanent finish. Lacquer can be worn off. And in fact, in the early days of manufacturing, there used to be a card in your instrument that said lacquer is a temporary finish. Like manufacturers would
Huh.
actually own up to the fact that this is temporary. You know, um, if you have a wooden house, how many times do you have to paint it in your lifetime? It's
Yeah.
not
Good point.
permanent, right? So lacquer is not a permanent thing. So but plating is much more permanent than lacquer. Although you can wear through plating, it takes longer. So that's why we put a nickel plated keys on student saxophones because of
Okay.
durability and longevity there. But
Okay.
in step up instruments, in performance grade instruments, in professional instruments, typically you'll see just lacquered keys on those instruments to match the body. Um,
Is that more for looks and tradition, or is there an actual musical reason to lacquer those instead of
I
plating
think
them?
it's a lot of looks and tradition. Like that's what a pro saxophone looks like. It doesn't have the different color of keys. However, there were some professional saxophones uh, early in like in the 60s and 70s and whatnot that had silver plated keys on a brass body. So it would look a
Hmm.
lot like a student model, except for it was a really nice professionally made instrument. It just happened to have silver plated keys. And I imagine that they did it for the same reason, right? They did it because they wanted some more durability on the part where your hands are touching all the time. And so they plated them in silver, and silver is a fine material. So that's why they did it. But yeah.
Okay. So so what do you feel as a saxophone player when you pick up a student saxophone, and then you pick up a pro saxophone? What do you feel under your fingers when it comes to the key work? What changes?
Well, like as far as key work, it's more elegant, it's more refined, it's more subtle. It doesn't require nearly as much effort to play because it's
Hmm.
lighter, it's smaller, it's more delicate. Um, same thing on like high end flutes and high end woodwind instruments in general. The mechanism can't, you want to avoid weight when you can. So on a really high end saxophone, the keys are not going to weigh as much as on a student model saxophone. So you'll feel that in the performance. It's like,
Hmm.
what's the difference between driving a lightweight Miata and a Suburban? Right?
Yeah,
A
a
lot,
lot.
a whole bunch. Like, you can get around a lot faster, but you're more
Hmm.
fragile, right? So
Okay.
look at a race
Yeah.
car, right? Look at Formula One cars. They're light and they're very agile, but they're very delicate too, right? But you feel that. So depending on the operator, of course, you will feel that nuance with a high end saxophone versus a student
Hmm.
model.
Okay. How do we achieve that? How do you make it feel the way you just described, that Miata, that sports car under your fingers in a pro sax? What do we do as a manufacturer to get to that level versus a student
Well,
level?
it has to do with pads. It has to do with springs. It has to do with length of spring, spring catch. It has to do with the weight of the keys. It has to do with the steels underneath them in the hinge tubes. It has to do with the pivot screws.
Hmm.
Like, the whole mechanism basically is finer, right? So you're really paying attention to every single detail, even down
Hmm.
to the glue. So
Wow.
like,
The glue for the
right,
pads.
the adhesive. So a lot for tradition, like, we've always used shellac as a tradition in saxophone padding and in saxophone making. And shellac is very brittle, but it's very hard too. Like, it's got a positive feel when that pad touches the tone hole. It feels very solid and stable. And but if it gets cold, it'll crack and it'll get brittle, and your pad will fall out. So
Hmm.
it's not ideal for marching band, right? So we don't make student
Right.
saxophones with shellac keeping the pads in place. We use a hot glue for lower end saxophones because it's much more forgiving. But because it's much more forgiving, it has a slightly more spongy feel, right? Because it has
Ah.
more give to it, and it won't. It's not brittle. It won't crack. It won't do those things. So for student saxophones, you pad them differently too, and that translates to the feel of the instrument, like the feel of the keywork underneath your fingers. As you put your fingers up and down, you're going to feel the difference in the impact of the pad.
Hmm.
And then the
Okay.
pad itself, the felt, the cardboard backing. Back in the old days, they used to use brass backed pads that have a really solid feel. But they're very hard to work with. So not a lot of manufacturers work with them. So how thick your cardboard is, how dense your felt is, the quality of the leather, the species of the leather,
Hmm.
all of that makes a difference in the contact of that pad onto the tone hole surface. So,
Okay. Are we using different materials on the pad surface itself from student saxophone up to professional? Are they
yes,
different?
yeah, at least in our line, we use a good pad for our students, but an economical pad, and
Is it
it's
still
still
leather?
leather, but
Okay.
it's a little bit more forgiving. It's not as rigid as maybe the and thin as the professional pads. So it gives you more
Hmm.
cushion, right? It gives you a little bit more for ease of padding and ease of playing. But when you get into the high level pads, the professional pads, we use a thinner, harder type pad that gives you uh, a more solid feel when it touches that tone hole. Yeah,
Okay. Okay. Hey, speaking of
yeah,
tone hole, sometimes in flute world we talk about soldered tone holes versus drawn tone
yes.
holes. What is it on most saxophones?
Well, on nearly 100% of saxophones made today, it is drawn tone holes. There has
Okay.
been in time a few different brands that have tried soldered tone holes, both soft soldered and silver soldered tone holes. Um, and some of them play very well, and some of them play average. But in today's world, we only use drawn tone holes. There's been a few attempts at soldered tone holes recently, but in for the masses, what you're going to see is drawn tone holes.
Okay. Okay. Good to know. All right. So, what else do we need to know about how these saxophones are made? Something you see across in most manufacturers' websites and catalogs. You see descriptions like ribbed
Sure.
construction. What is
What is
that?
that? So a ribbed construction, that has to do with the mechanism. And there's two basic ways that you can do it. You can have your posts connected to a rib, and then you solder that whole rib to the body of the saxophone with your posts already attached. And the other way is you can solder each individual post of the mechanism to the body individually. And there is debate. What is better? What is pro? What is intermediate? And I think that debate will live on as far as
Hmm.
which is the best. Some companies make a fully ribbed construction saxophone. Some make partially ribbed construction saxophones. Some make post to body, and some manufacturers put the post to body as the lower level price point, and some put it as the higher level price point.
Hmm.
So it is, but it is nothing more than just a system of attaching the mechanism to the body.
Okay. So it's that if you look at the body, you can see there's this like little extra plate of brass,
Yes,
right?
you'll see
That
posts.
connects the keys and the
Yep.
posts to the body. What's the point of that? Is there any benefit to having a ribbed construction?
Well, to my thinking, it helps with assembly. So if you can manufacture the rib and the post together in a jig, and then you can just put one piece on this instrument, a solder from point A to point B, then you're done, and then you can assemble your mechanism versus each individual
Hmm.
post. The other thing that I feel it does as a player, and I tend to like more of a ribbed construction saxophone versus a post to body type, just because I feel like it has better sound quality. I feel like it's more
Hmm.
substantial. I feel like the mechanism is more stable, in a way. And so to me, I think that the rib construction is a plus in a professional saxophone.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Good to know. Another thing you see in the bullet points of description on a lot of saxophone makers' websites is high F sharp key
Yes.
on various saxophones. Which saxophones come with that, and why?
Well, today, pretty much all of the saxophones can come with a high F sharp. And even now, there are some saxophones that come with a high G. Yeah,
Oh.
so especially in soprano, you will see instruments to high G. It's essentially giving you an additional tone hole at the top of your instrument to sound these altissimo notes without using an overtone fingering. And so
So it sounds
it
better?
sounds clearer. It can,
Hmm.
not even that. I mean, if you're really astute and you practice your overtones and you are a student of the saxophone, you can play a high F sharp without a high F sharp key rather easily. It's
Hmm.
just it's something that has been added to the saxophone and is easier in some passages, but it isn't even necessary. Our student models, we
Hmm.
don't include a high F sharp for alto or tenor, and we did that because it's just another pad for the repairman to fix in a rental pool, and you're not
Hmm.
going to see high F sharps in junior high band literature.
Huh. Okay. So it's more advanced players and a more advanced
Correct.
feature.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Makes sense. You see springs, the material of the
Mm-hmm.
springs
Mm-hmm.
described across saxophone manufacturers and different
Mm-hmm.
levels of quality. What's the story there?
So basically, you have like a stainless steel spring, which is just a nice round stock, or blued steel is probably what you read a lot. Blued steel, and bluing steel is an anti-corrosive. So we
Hmm.
like the springiness, the feel of a steel spring, and I like a blued steel, and the bluing is just to keep it from rusting because it is like we are blowing moist air into these instruments. There is water that comes out of the tone holes. It can collect around these strings and they can rust. So bluing is an anti-corrosive process.
Hmm.
That's what that
Okay.
means. But I like the ferrous steel springs because just the way they feel under the fingers, the snappy nature of them. So that's why we use a different spring on a more professional saxophone versus a student saxophone. Plus, cost is involved too.
Okay.
Like bluing steel, that is, you can buy some wire stock of stainless steel and cut them, and it's much more efficient, but it just doesn't feel exactly the same under your fingers.
Okay. Yeah. Good to know. So, what else are we changing between a student level saxophone that's, let's say, the street price is $1,800 on the student saxophone, and then mom and dad come into the music store and the student wants to purchase a $4,000 saxophone, a pro saxophone, but they look pretty
Right.
similar. What do you describe to parents? What's changing physically? Let's say dad's an
Okay.
engineer and he wants to know everything about what changed between the student instrument and the pro instrument. What do you tell
Well,
them?
it's all in the body. We can talk about springs, we can talk about pads, we can talk about felts and corks, and we can talk about the hand craftsmanship of putting the instrument together and making sure that the mechanism is finely adjusted. Right, that's part of it. But really, in the resonance area and in the sound quality area, what we're talking about is the body itself, the neck, the body, the bottom bow, and the bell. And the weight of those parts, the way we take them from a sheet of brass or a tube, or if we use a tube, but how we take it from that raw state of just a sheet of brass and make it into a round cone. And so the process makes a lot of difference. When you're talking about an instrument, my personal preference is sheet brass. So when we make a neck, it's a seamed tube. It starts out as a flat sheet of brass. It's cut in a pattern.
Hmm.
It's brazed together. It's drawn and bent, and it's hand hammered and annealed along the way. And those processes make it more
Hmm.
resonant. That makes that brass
It's funny.
ring.
You could be describing a trumpet bell
I
right there.
totally could. In fact, saxophones are, in fact, made very similarly to brass instruments. It is made of brass, after all.
Right.
So
Right.
lots of
Interesting. Okay.
similarities. When we talk about the body tube, it is not a tube that is drawn and expanded. It's a sheet of brass, again, that is seamed. And for student model products, it's seamed in a process that's lower temperature and more efficient and easier. But in more expensive instruments, it's brazed. And there's tabs cut and it's overlapped and it has to go through a seam roller and it has to be brazed at a very high temperature and it has to be hammered and annealed and hammered and annealed in order to get it from its original shape into the shape that you see as a saxophone. So that's a difference between the bodies. And then when you're talking
Hmm.
about the bottom bows, that U-shaped piece of brass at the bottom of the saxophone, on a student model, we hydroform that. We do it in a process that saves labor and time, and it has one seam, the inside radius. But on a professional saxophone, we make it as a clamshell. We make it in two pieces, and we
Hmm.
braze those two pieces together. So you have a seam at the inner radius and a seam at the outer radius. And the reason we do that is because we can maintain a wall thickness much better in that fashion versus a hydroforming. Because when you hydroform the bottom bow, the bottom of it will be thinner brass, and the inner radius will be thicker brass, just from the nature of the stretching of the brass.
Yeah.
And so, but as a trumpet player, you would know that evenness of wall is kind of important for the resonance of those parts.
Hmm.
So to have a bottom bow be even from inner radius to outer radius is an important thing. We do the same thing on tubas. We do the same thing on euphoniums. We do the same thing on baritones. Anything that has a bottom bow, we do the same process for professional instruments. And then with the bell, you could have a two-piece bell, or you could have a one-piece bell. And my preference is always a one-piece bell, so we make our professional instruments in one piece. But truth be told, we make our student models in a one-piece bell as well, just because we have efficiencies in our facility to accommodate that. But that's really the difference. So when you're talking about, if you use sheet brass on both student and professional, then you're really talking about the process in which you took that sheet of brass and made it into the saxophone part. Did you use a
Hmm.
hydroforming press? Did you use a machine? Did you use a hammer and an arbor and anneal it and go back and forth and really process that brass the same way you would on any brass instrument for a professional quality product, whether it's a trumpet, a trombone, a tuba, a French horn, whatever.
Yeah. So if I were to summarize to this engineering dad that's asking these questions, it's really the overall shape might look similar, but it's the process and how it
Yep,
got there is what's really making the difference. You can't necessarily see it, but you can hear
totally.
it. Okay. Okay, that helps. So one question I have is about the bell. You see various shapes of bells in saxophones. Some are very wide compared to others that are fairly narrow. What's the reason behind that?
Well, it's probably just that company's idea on the bore. And if you're talking about the flare part, they can vary as far as the size of flare. Um, like back in the 20s and 30s, Bisher was making these really large flared saxophones. Herb Cuff did it. Like there's, Kiowa still does it. And so, when we made our 52nd Street, we went back to those early American saxophones that had gigantic bells. We didn't
Hmm.
really change the taper of the bell too much, but what we did was we expanded the flare so that it had more mass at the end of the saxophone. But there, throughout the years, there's been different uh, takes on the bore of the saxophone and how that taper, develops through the course of the bore. So you'll see different shapes of bells, but primarily today, what we're seeing mostly is in the flare, not in the actual bell part. Yeah,
Okay. So how does it change the sound? Let's say you have a wide flare, like our 52nd
yeah.
Street, and then you have a more narrow flare. How does that change to the listener? What do you
Well,
hear?
I think it has to do with mass, right? So you have more mass on the 52nd Street. It's a bigger, more brilliant, a broader sound. And the Rue St. George is a more focused, centered, compact sound.
Okay. Can you describe that Rue St. George term you just said for those who are maybe not familiar?
Centered, focused, compact.
The Rue
Oh,
St.
the Rue St.
George. That
George.
what is the Rue St.
Oh, the
George?
Rue St. George is our other voice of saxophone. So when we started with saxophones, it was with the 52nd Street, and it was paying homage to the American saxophone. And I like to say that it's really trying to emulate pre-World War II American saxophones. That's the
Hmm.
vintage that we're really striving for as far as like the build of that saxophone and the sound quality of that saxophone. And then the Rue St. George is basically inspired by post-war French saxophones. So that era of saxophone making in France, that's the type of
Hmm.
sound quality that I'm going for with that saxophone. So those two instruments together give us our two voices of saxophone that we're trying to achieve.
Okay, great. Thanks. One thing I want to go back on, going back into some of the specifications in the baritone
Mm-hmm.
saxophone. A lot of times, these bullet points I'm mentioning, it talks about springs and ribs, and then in a bari, it also mentions a low
Yeah,
A or a low B
right.
flat. What's the benefit of one or the other?
So the low A baritone, um, that's recent, really. I mean, recent, I guess, when you talk about the history of the saxophone, it wasn't invented with a low A. In fact, the low B flat wasn't even part of the original saxophones. They only went down to B. And so that was
Hmm.
added later. That's the other thing that other makers have contributed to the evolution and the development of the saxophone throughout time. And so the B flat was added, and you'll still see some saxophones in the mid 1800s before like 1890s that still have only a low B bell, and so the
Hmm.
B flat was kind of, oh, here's another note, right? And so the low A baritone wasn't the only low A saxophone that was ever experimented with. There's been low A altos as well, and low A basses, and so the low A is has been kind of experimented with in multiple voices of saxophone. It kind of stuck with the baritone, and if you look at the literature for baritone, because the low A baritone existed, then composers started writing for it, and now it's kind of like if
Hmm.
you play advanced literature, you have to have a low A because composers like that concert C, that comes out of it. So. Um, it kind of started with the Mule Quartet. So the Paris Conservatory, the saxophone professor was a gentleman by the name of Marcel Mule, and he was the second saxophone professor at the Paris Conservatory after the first one being Adolphe Sax. There
Huh.
was a time where there wasn't saxophone instruction or saxophone teacher because Marcel Mule was in the 20th century, not in the 19th century. But he was the saxophone professor, and he formed a saxophone quartet, which was a soprano, alto, tenor, baritone quartet. And this quartet, there wasn't a lot of literature written for saxophone quartet when they formed this group because it was kind of new, like it wasn't a thing. And so what they did was they played a lot of string quartet transcriptions. And, in a string quartet, you have two violins, a viola, and a cello. And so in the saxophone quartet, with being soprano sax, alto sax, tenor sax, baritone sax, the baritone sax was responsible for the cello part. And a cello, the lowest note on a cello is a written C. And the lowest note on the baritone was not. And so they had to add that. It was a D flat C sharp. So the low A is a written C. It is a concert C on an E flat baritone saxophone. So adding this extra note allowed the baritone saxophonist to play the cello part in the original keys. So that's kind of why it started. And then, of course, it was cool because it had a bigger bell and everyone wanted to have a low A. But even then, in America, student manufacturers still made low B flat baritones because you didn't have the music. It wasn't written to low A. It was lighter. It was easier for a young person. So, and they blow different. They blow completely different from a low A. That extra mass changes the character of that saxophone.
I believe it. It's amazing how much lighter. Our Eastman has a new EBS 251, which we're super excited about. It's amazing how much lighter that 251 is with a low B flat than something with a low A. It's I don't know what the poundage is, but it's significant.
It balances different too. So part of the weight that you're feeling is the balance is different. You don't have all that mass on the front of the horn, farthest away from your body. So the center mass is a little bit different. So that kind of disguises some of the weight savings too. But yeah, they went away. And the reason I think low B flat baritones went away because there was a rush of imports and they were less expensive than the American made saxophones. And so why not get one that's less expensive and has a low A? So it kind of went away, and then the U.S. manufacturers stopped making the saxophones in the United States, and they started outsourcing their goods or their manufacturing to vendors, and so all we were left with was low A baritone saxophones. And this new 251 model is kind of my hope that there's still a market for a low B flat baritone saxophone for young people and for doublers and for jazz musicians and people that just want an affordable baritone saxophone with the characteristics of a low B flat bell rather than a low A bell.
Yeah. Okay. Who would you suggest this B flat, low B flat Barry to? Is it mostly younger students?
For sure, beginning bands. I don't think that you should save the weight, save the child's neck. Make sure that you're giving a young person something that is a little bit more manageable and lighter. I don't think a lot of music calls for it in beginning band. So definitely for your beginning band. I think it's also appropriate for doublers. I think it's appropriate for people that just want a baritone and are on a budget. People that play in jazz combos, people that want that characteristic sound of that, and also marching bands. I think that if you're going to march Barry, march a low B flat Barry and save your back. So I think that beginning bands, doublers, and marching bands, I think are prime audience for the ed reps out there that are calling on schools.
Yeah. Okay. So when does it become necessary for a school to have a low A instead of a low B flat?
When the music calls for it. When the literature requires the low A.
Okay. It could be middle school, could be high school, just depending on the music they're playing.
Depends on the music, depends on the range of the saxophone parts, the bare saxophone parts that are written.
All right. Good. So we could go down a whole rabbit hole on this next topic, but I just want to go over the basics on mouthpieces and setup and reeds and things like that. Something that an ed rep should know about what to look for in basic. Let's just start with the student product. Like what makes a good student mouthpiece?
I think conservative facing makes a good student mouthpiece. There's these.
What does that mean?
So the tip opening is not so wide. The facing maybe isn't quite as long. I think something in the medium range. medium tip opening, medium facing is a good place to start for most students. A not paper thin, soft reed. I shouldn't say thin because they're all the same thickness. But starting kids on a 2 to 2.5 saxophone reed, I think, is a good place to start, depending on your altitude and your climate. If you're in the mountains like me, definitely softer. If you're down, in Florida, maybe 2.5 to 3 is better to start on. But it, your environment kind of dictates some of that too, not just your physical ability. So for us, we put in Leger reeds in our instruments. So when you rent a brand new Eastman saxophone, it comes with a Leger 2 strength, which it plays a little harder than a cane 2. So we kind of think about like 2.25, 2.5 type strengths for our beginning saxophone players. And then just a good conservative mouthpiece with a medium tip opening and a medium facing. And we could go into a rabbit hole on measurements and all of those things. But I think if you're dealing with a reputable brand, that should have been thought about, and it should be geared towards a classical nature versus like a jazz style mouthpiece to start with. And jazz style mouthpieces, typically the differences is you'll have wider tip openings. You'll have baffles in the vamp area inside the mouthpiece to speed the velocity of the air up. And you'll have different materials too that can be used, like metal mouthpieces and whatnot. Although that's not 100% true. There were classical metal mouthpieces made a long time ago. So it has to do with the facing and the tip opening and the vamp and the chamber, essentially just to increase the velocity and make it brighter and louder for a jazz performance.
Okay. So I want to go back on something you mentioned a moment ago, the Leger reeds, the synthetic reeds. Why did you choose to put those in a case as opposed to the
cane
traditional
reeds?
cane reeds?
Well, they're a little hardier. They don't break as easy. So for a beginner that's never handled reeds before, it's kind of nice to know that, it won't just chip and crack and be done in 2 seconds. So that's part of it. Plus, they're very consistent. So when you're talking about like a synthetic reed, like a Leger reed, that kid who starts on that instrument can use that Leger reed for all of band camp and into the first term of school. And the teacher can know that it's, whatever's happening, that reed is really consistent. Like, it's very difficult to have bad reed days when your reed is made of a polymer like this, where it's not changed by the rain or the humidity or anything like that. So it just gives students a more consistent beginning.
Makes sense. Yeah, I like it. So the ligature holding on these reeds, we have a few various kinds of ligatures out there in the world. And you have metal ligatures, you have Rovner ligatures. What's the difference?
Oh gosh,
why is one better than another?
That is a conversation that is way too long to have. It's
another rabbit hole.
I mean, same thing with mouthpieces, right? Like, my wife gives me a hard time because when I play a mouthpiece and I like it, I want to add it to my collection. I've got in alto, I think I've got somewhere around like 40 mouthpieces, and that's a small collection compared to some. But it's a large collection compared to others too. So, but when you're talking about ligatures, I think my ligature collection is almost, it's large. And you have string ligatures and metal ligatures and fabric ligatures. And, some people say mass is amazing. And some people say, no, you don't want any mass. Some people want rails to hold the reed on. Some people want dots to hold the reed on. Some people want a plate to hold the reed on. Wow. It can get incredibly nuanced when you're talking about ligatures and the effect that they have on the reed. Reed is most important, right? Your reed doesn't work, your horn doesn't work. I have a friend who his tagline on his email says, "You're only as good as your reed," and that's so true. The ligature is the thing that attaches it to the mouthpiece, so that becomes very important as well. And then, of course, the interaction between the reed, the ligature, and the mouthpiece is where most of your sound comes from. So they are incredibly overlooked, in my opinion. We choose to use Rovner ligatures on our student products because of their durability, firstly. Like when you
Okay.
drop a metal ligature on the ground, which happens all the time, it's going to bend and warp and change its round shape to an oval shape.
Right. And then if you step on it, that's
Then
another
if you
story.
step on it, then it may not work ever again, because if you bend it back,
Hmm.
it could crack. So there's a lot of reasons to use a Rovner. You can drop it, step on it, drive over it with your car, and stick it back on your mouthpiece, and it will work. So that's firstly the reason that we use it. Plus, it does a nice job holding the reed. It does a little bit of a better job holding the reed, in my opinion, than basic student model ligatures. So you get an upgraded performance as well. But a lot of it is because of that durability and ease of use factor that
Hmm.
comes along with using those ligatures.
Okay. Okay. Good. The next topic is care and maintenance of saxophones. What should an ed rep know about how to take care of a saxophone? What to suggest to teachers and to students, and just kind of the daily
Sure.
basics?
So first things first, swab it every day. Band directors, if you don't give your kids time at the end of class to swab their instruments, that is why they smell bad. Um,
Ah,
there needs to be time to maintain your instrument and swab out the product. Having appropriate swabs. I am a fan of pull through swabs. I am not a fan of like the stick it in and forget it type swabs. Um, I just don't see how that functions correctly.
hmm.
So I really like pull through swabs. Fabric can be debatable whether you want like a cheesecloth type fabric or a silk fabric or a microfiber type fabric. The key here is that it covers the walls of the saxophone and draws the moisture out. So having that product, I think, is truly important. Having an adequate swab, that is the number one, and having it be a pull through style. You'll need two swabs, or you'll need a swab that can not only swab the body of the saxophone but also the neck, which is where
Hmm.
most of the moisture is anyway. Baritone saxophones are slightly different because of the crook at the top. It's very difficult to pull through a swab on a baritone saxophone. And so for me, I'm a real fan of the Hodge baritone saxophone swabs, which is like silk wrapped around a springy stick. So it'll
Hmm.
bend around the crook of the baritone saxophone and remove moisture. So for baritones, I think you need some type of push swab that will get the moisture out of the crook area. It doesn't really go too far down the body because of the crook, and then you'll need a pull through swab for your neck.
That makes
Yeah, but
sense.
swabbing your horn is the most important thing that you can do to keep it in good playing condition. And then also, I'm a huge fan of these key props that prop open your G sharp and your C sharp on your saxophone. We'll give a little
Hmm.
plug to Rulon Brown and Key Leaves, because he has come up with this pretty ingenious way to leave your keys open. That's why they're called key leaves. And it's essentially
Hmm.
you stick it underneath your low C sharp key and your E flat key, and it props open the G sharp in the middle of the body. Those are the three pads that are closed all the time. Every other pad on the main body of the saxophone, not excluding palm keys and side keys, those are the ones that are closed that get the most moisture. And so by propping
Hmm.
them open, you'll still allow that horn to dry by having those pads off of the tone holes and
Ah.
allowing the air to get in. The other thing is the end cap. Like, end caps are tricky because they keep your saxophone in the case from shifting around. And
Hmm.
student horns come with a plastic end cap that's closed at the top. And professional saxophones, at least ours do, come with a saxophone cap, an end cap that's open at the top. It's got a hole through it that, again, just allows air to travel through the saxophone while it's in the case. It doesn't close it off. So propping open those keys can keep them from getting sticky. But if you just swab out your saxophone every time you play and remove the moisture from it, it's going to do wonders for the daily care of that instrument. Other than that, there's not a lot of daily maintenance that's necessary. Just wipe off your
Okay.
fingerprints and swab out your horn. Yeah,
Okay. Good to
yeah.
know. It's not too
Yeah.
bad. Something I hear fairly often is my sax has a leak.
Yeah.
What is that? What does it sound like? How can you tell your saxophone has a
Well,
leak?
the note doesn't play. So yeah, saxophones are tricky, like all woodwind instruments, because those pads have to close around the tone hole, and they have to do it fairly completely. Otherwise, the note will not sound. And saxophone leaks are very, very difficult to diagnose where they are coming from. Like if you have a saxophone that has a difficult speaking low B, then your G sharp is probably out of adjustment in the middle of the horn. So there's best to take it into the repair shop in most circumstances in any leaky woodwind instrument, because it requires a good deal of skill to diagnose it and to repair it.
Yeah, that's when they'll put a leak light down it and look for all
That's
that,
right.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yep. A good reminder for another episode of Ed Rep Radio, Scott Mandeville's band repair. Scott did a great job of describing very common things like that and what to look for. So make sure you check that one out.
Yeah, I mean, little
One more
things
question,
like spring
Ryan.
hooks and stuff, like those are things that I can say in the field, take care of. Like if a spring is off its catch and you can find it and things like that. But if the horn is leaking, I think it's best to take it into repair shop.
Yeah. So one more question.
Yes, sir.
Why are Ed Reps always taking in baritone saxophones to the repair shop?
Because
it seems like one of the most common instruments.
Yeah, it sure is, because it's big. Because it's big, and it's bigger than the alto that student came from, or the tenor, and they're not used to the size, and it gets bumped around and hit on the ground, and they just don't understand the size of that horn, and so it's a little bit clumsy. It's actually quite clumsy at times for junior high and middle school, and even high school students. It's the same reason they're taking in tubas and baritones all the time too, because those are the bigger instruments that are difficult to wield from a young person.
So the bigger they are, the harder they fall?
Kind of. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I think. Plus the cases are heavy, and they drop them, and the handles break because the cases are heavy, and the horns are heavy, and it's just a lot of heavy metal.
Heavy metal. Yep. Having carried so many Barry saxes down hallways with no outside door. In fact, the band room that your wife teaches at now, no outside door. Had carried so many berries down that hallway, way out to the van.
Or up and down the stairs at the closer door, right? It's just like, oh my gosh, I gotta take all 3 Barry saxophones down the stairs. Yeah, you got your steps in that for sure.
Yeah, that was a workout. Well, Ryan, I can't thank you enough. It was fun talking to you about one of your favorite topics. I could tell there's so much more that we could talk about and so much more knowledge we could draw on. But maybe that'll be Saxophones 201.
Sure. Yeah, we can do it. I love to talk about saxophones, so anytime you want.
Sounds good. Thanks again. We hope you found the information in this episode useful and something you can use in your everyday life as an Ed Rep. If there is a topic you'd like to learn more about and have presented on a future episode of Ed Rep Radio, or you'd like to give us some feedback in general, please email us at edrepradio@eastmanstrings.com. To learn more about Eastman Music Company, go to our website, eastmanmusiccompany.com, or give your Eastman rep a call. Thanks, and drive safe.